Okay, we're continuing learning about the digestive system and we're getting into some more detailed and advanced concepts now. So the learning intention is the same, and the success criteria, you should be able to do these things. Describe the 3 types of macronutrients and list the general enzymes which break down each of those nutrients. Describe the tissue layers in the digestive system, and then describe the detailed structure and the detailed function of how the small intestine works. We're going to focus just on that organ. It's probably the most important organ in the digestive system. So we're going to start off broad, talking about macronutrients. So macronutrients are large molecules. So they're still made of atoms, just like every other molecule. They come from other organisms, and they give us energy in our food. So essentially, all our food is made up of these biomacromolecules. And there's 3 main types that our food is made of. If you do health or PE, you often come across these 3 types. So we've got carbohydrates and lipids, which are fats and oils, and we've got proteins. Here's a typical, it's a pretty old photo by now, but it's a typical week's diet of an Australian family. And compared to other nations around the world, Australia has a really high protein diet. You can see how much meat and eggs this family eats on average. It's just a cultural thing in Australia. We tend to have a really high protein diet. And it depends on the culture and the resources of different areas, and lots of countries have really different diets. So all these macronutrients, the whole point of the digestive system is to break apart these big macromolecules using enzymes. So every macronutrient has a different enzyme that digests it and breaks it down. Enzymes, we haven't learnt much about them, but they're proteins. So they're made by ribosomes in cells, and then they get secreted by the cells using one of the methods of leaving the cell, and they go into the digestive system and break down those molecules. All right, let's look at those 3 types with a bit more detail. Here's carbohydrates. We call them carbs in everyday life a lot of the time. And it's all these foods that have sugar, starch, and fibers. So that's what those molecules actually can, that's where you can find carbohydrate molecules. So if we zoom in and look at a carbohydrate molecule, it's basically made of a whole lot of little simple sugar molecules like glucose or maltose. And the enzymes that we make in our digestive system to break them down, to break down carbohydrates, are called amylases. So here's one example here. To break down starch, we can use an enzyme called amylase, and it breaks it down into tiny little maltose individual molecules. And that's the process of digestion for these particular molecules. Lipids, so fats and oils, their building blocks are glycerol and fatty acids. Fatty acids should be familiar because we've seen them before in these little molecules here when we learned about the cell membrane. So remember, the cell membrane is made of a phospholipid bilayer. So fatty acids are these little tails at the bottom, and it's also these long sections here. So when you break apart a lipid, you get these free fatty acids and you get a glycerol molecule as well. And the enzymes breaking down the lipids are lipase enzymes. Enzymes are really easy to remember. They always end in ASE, basically telling us what that enzyme does. Lipases break down lipids. Proteins, well, they're made from amino acids. And remember, the job of the ribosomes in cells is to make proteins. Proteins do a whole lot of things in the cell. But for our foods, it's all these types of protein-rich foods that we know about. So eggs and meat and fish, and dairy has quite a bit of protein in as well. The enzyme that breaks down proteins are called proteases. So here's some proteins being digested, and then it breaks it down into these single amino acids, and then they're ready to be absorbed by the digestive system. All right, the next thing we need to look at is go back to those tissue layers which we learnt in the last section. So remember, all organs in mammals are made of 4 different tissue layers. We've got epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So the GI tract, which is the whole digestive system, it's got 4 different layers of tissue, and they're pretty much using all 4 of the different tissue types to build it. This is how it's evolved. So we're looking at the stomach here, but it pretty much looks the same if you were to cut open the small intestine or the large intestine. They'd all have these 4 layers still. So we'll start off with the inner layer here. It's got the scientific names down here, which is the mucosa, but we don't really need to know them. So the inner layer, it's built up using some epithelial tissue, which is a really important layer. We'll look at that later. And there's also connective tissue there as well. The whole function of this inner layer is to absorb the nutrients. So that's the key tissue in the digestive system. The second layer, if we go out again, which is called the submucosa, it's just made up of connective tissue. It also contains blood vessels and nerves. So that means there is nervous tissue built in there as well. Every organ needs a blood supply, and every organ needs some nerves that can actually control it. So that's that second layer. If we go out again to this reddy looking layer here, to this section here, red's a big giveaway. It's muscle tissue, and it can move, and that controls the movement of our food through the digestive system. And then the outer layer, which is the yellow and red dot section, it's made up of connective tissue, and that just holds the whole stomach or the whole organ together as the outer layer. So just like every organ, it's made up of all those 4 types of connective tissue. It's made up of all those 4 types of tissue, and it just happens to have 4 layers. Finally, the lumen, that's the space on the inside of our gastrointestinal tract, where the food passes through and where the digestion actually happens. Here's a cross-section of a microscope image, a micrograph of an actual human small intestine. And it's really clearly showing all these 4 layers. So we've got the lumen in here where all the food and the digestion's happening. We've got our first layer of epithelial and connective tissue. We've got that second layer of connective tissue where all the veins, arteries, and nerves are. We've got the muscle layer, and we've got that outer layer here of connective tissue. All right, we're going to focus on the small intestine for the last section. So the stomach connects up here. So obviously the food is passing down this way. There's 3 main parts of the small intestine that we'll focus on. So we divide them up based on what they do. It's a whole organ, but it does have separate sections that have different jobs. So the earliest part where the food reaches is called the duodenum. It's quite small. Then we get to the jejunum, which makes up about almost half. And then we get to the ileum, which makes up the other half. And then once the food passes through the small intestine, we go to the large intestine. So remembering back to the function of the small intestine, the main purposes are absorption. And to finish off digestion as well. So we're finishing breaking apart our macromolecules into the smaller molecules, and then we absorb them into the bloodstream, and that's the key role of the small intestine. So let's look at a bit more detail now. this is the whole intestine, and we can clearly see those 4 layers. Inside the intestine, the whole point is it's got a really high surface area. We're back to that old concept of surface area to volume ratio. Because if you've got more surface area, you've got more availability to bring all those nutrients in and absorb as much nutrition as you can from the foods that we're eating. We wouldn't want a low surface area because then food would just pass straight through the small intestine and we couldn't get all those nutrients out that we need. So the way we've evolved a high surface area in animals is to have folds firstly. So you can see these big folds and small folds in the lining of the small intestine. If we zoom into those folds, they've got smaller folds again, and they're called villi that look like these little fingers of cells. And you can really clearly see here the lining of epithelial cells. That's making up that inner lining there. So this little line of pink cells around here, it's just one cell layer thick. And that's the vital layer of cells because that's how food is actually getting from inside the lumen into our body. Technically, food doesn't enter our body until it crosses that lining of cells. And then it becomes part of our body. So inside the villi, you can see we've got blood vessels. So there's tiny little blood vessels called capillaries going up there. So they're from the circulatory system. And then this yellow tube in here is a vessel from the lymphatic system. And that helps to absorb and carry nutrients as well. So the villi have a huge surface area because they're up and down. So there's a region all the way around them to absorb food. And then there's a third layer of increase in their surface area because if we zoom into one of those epithelial cells in our last picture, they've got these tiny little microvilli on the top as part of their cell membrane. So there's 3 layers of really high surface area to absorb all those nutrients. And what we've actually worked out is with all that combined surface area, so the villi and the microvilli, it equates to about 250 square meters of area to absorb our food, which is basically the size of a tennis court to absorb our food. All right, let's go into some detailed functions about how the small intestine does what it does, which is absorbing food. So we'll start off with a bit of review. Remember, if we look in this section here, which is the duodenum, the start of the small intestine, remember this is where the bile comes in from the bile duct, from the gallbladder, and it's also where all the enzymes come in from the pancreas as well. And pancreatic fluid, it contains all 3 of those types of enzymes that we've talked about. So it's got amylases that can digest carbohydrates, it's got lipases for fats and oils, and it's got proteases to break down all the proteins. Some of those enzymes still were added earlier. So amylases are in our saliva, so we've started to break things down earlier. But this is like the second level of digestion, basically. So as soon as all those enzymes and the bile enters the duodenum, then we're getting a whole lot more digestion happening. So here's our starches being broken down, our carbohydrates. Here's our lipids, and here's our proteins. And so now we're really finishing off digestion, and ideally we're going to have all these tiny small molecules, and these are the ones that can get across the cell membrane a bit more easily. We can't bring a whole protein, and we can't bring a whole lipid and a whole starch across the cell membrane. A final note to remember is that the stomach has a really low pH. Remember, the stomach is about pH 2 to 3, highly acidic. That helps a few of the stomach enzymes to break down what they needed to. But by the time we're in the small intestine, the pH is closer to neutral and slightly alkaline, so pH 7 to 9. And this is because it's got different types of enzymes, and enzymes have different optimal pHs where they work best at. Alright, so we've broken down all of our macromolecules, we've finished digestion. Now we need to absorb all the molecules. So remember, absorption is just moving the digested molecules from the lumen, which is the space on the inside of our intestine, across the epithelium into the bloodstream. And cells do it using all the processes that we've learnt already. So some molecules can move through simple diffusion to get into our epithelial cells. So here's one epithelial cell here. If you're a fatty acid molecule, well then you're hydrophobic, so you can just diffuse across the cell membrane and get inside the cell. So fatty acids can use simple diffusion or any other hydrophobic molecules. But for most of the other molecules, like the sugars from the carbohydrates and the amino acids from the proteins, they're going to have to use facilitated diffusion because they're hydrophilic and so they can't just diffuse straight across the membrane. So those molecules are going to be using either facilitated diffusion or active transport, depending on the molecules. There's also one other type of cell that I didn't mention earlier. It's these larger ones out here that are part of the villi. They're called goblet cells. And goblet cells' job is to secrete mucus into the small intestine, and the mucus helps all the chyme, or the semi-digested food, to pass through nice and smoothly. So essentially we can picture all these small digested molecules. They're no longer macromolecules, they're just molecules, and now they're small enough to diffuse straight through into the bloodstream, or they're going to need active transport to get in through those epithelial cells into the bloodstream. And that's how we get nutrients and energy from our foods. So the last section is just to think about what gets absorbed where. So the job of the duodenum is to absorb fatty acids. That happens first. Then when the food passes along to the jejunum, it absorbs most of the rest of the nutrients, the amino acids and the sugars. And the ileum's job is essentially to reabsorb what's left. So it absorbs a whole lot of vitamins and it also reabsorbs all the bile. So remember, the bile helps to make fatty acids more soluble and dissolves them. And there's no point wasting the bile because we need to reuse it back up at the top in the duodenum. So the ileum reabsorbs the bile and eventually it gets sent back to the liver, and then it goes back through the gallbladder back to the duodenum again to do its job. Alright, so we've digested our food, we've absorbed all the nutrients, and then whatever's left goes to the large intestine, which, remember, absorbs the water, and then all that we've got left over is the waste that we don't need. Okay, that's the details of the digestive system. So check all these learning intentions, ask any questions that you have, and thanks for listening.